right. Hello, friends. Welcome to our June Facebook Live session. I can't believe it's June already, but if you look out the window, you can see the sun is shining, and summer has finally arrived here in Toronto. So I'm thrilled. I love summertime. So my name is Dr. Mary Sunderland, and I am the Director of Research and Education here at the Foundation Fighting Blindness in Canada. And today is a very special Facebook Live session because I am joined by the one and only, my colleague, Dr. Chad Andrews. Chad and I work together here at the Foundation Fighting Blindness. Chad is the FFB's Research and Education Officer, so we do lots of things together throughout the week. And in that role, we work together on the research, education programs, but I will let Dr. Andrews introduce himself in a little more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So I guess first of all, I'm just really happy to be here. I've had the opportunity to tune into a couple of Facebook Live sessions already, and I think that it's a great way to communicate to our supporters and to patients that we work with. The work that I do, and it's kind of an evolving role, but as it stands right now, the work that I do is kind of divided between two primary focuses. So on the one hand, I work very closely with Mary, as she indicated already, on the Foundation's educational and outreach initiatives. So, for example, we were recently in Timmins hosting an educational session there at the local hospital focused on eye diseases and the resources available in Timmins and the surrounding area for those who are affected by retinal eye diseases. And it was an outstanding session. Attendance was wonderful. We were working very closely with a couple of local ophthalmologists in the area. And really, that's one of the ways that we kind of go directly into communities to get a sense of what's happening with people's vision care, what's available to them, and what are the ways that we can help them get access to essential services. So that's just an example of some of the outreach that we actually do, and we'll be holding similar events over the course of the year. So if you're actually interested in those educational sessions, you can go to our website and look up Vision Quest. It's under the Learn tab, which is at the top of the main page on ffb.ca. And on that page, we've listed the educational sessions associated with Vision Quest that we're going to have over the remainder of this year. I also spend a lot of time on the phone with patients and supporters, just kind of talking about the work that we're doing, the research that we're helping advance, answering questions about eye diseases and work that's being done to sort of address them and to push the research forward, because that's one of the primary things that we do at the Foundation. As you know, we're focused on pushing the research forward. So that's kind of one area that I'm focused on is education and outreach. I work closely with Mary on that, as I said. The other aspect of my work kind of involves pushing forward public policy that helps provide the framework for advancing vision research. So at the Foundation, we're very focused on research, as I said, but we know for a fact that research cannot thrive without the public policy framework that's going to enable it to do so. So I was in Ottawa not too long ago working with some of our partner organizations to communicate the need for healthy vision policy to MPs and policymakers to make sure that here in Canada we have the kind of policy that we need to make sure that people are able to get their hands on necessary vision research. And that we're meeting a certain kind of global standard when it comes to vision health in the country. So that's sort of the general sense of what I do, and like I said, we're still kind of figuring this out, so that could evolve over time, but those are my two primary focuses in this role.
So we're really glad to have Chad on board. Probably some of you have already met him or been emailing with him, so it's good to be able to get to know him a little bit better today. And I wanted to add that Chad was talking about some of the in-person education sessions that we do, and we'll make sure that we post a link so that you can go, and if you don't see your city or your community there and you think it would be great to have us come and learn more about what's happening in your community, let us know, right?
Absolutely.
And then the other piece why we need Chad more than ever here is because it's not just making sure that good research policies are in place, but it's making sure that we are ready here in Canada for innovative emerging therapies. And so today we're going to be talking, focusing in on clinical trials. So that's a kind of research that happens sort of after basic discoveries have been made in the laboratory. And we're at a really exciting time because there are so many clinical trials happening right now. And in fact, one of those trials is getting ready to become a treatment. And when that work happens, there's a lot of advocacy work, public policy work that needs to take place to make sure that we're ready here in Canada to make sure we get those treatments. So let's jump right into it. So just like every session, every month, this e-news or this Facebook Live session will be based on the stories that were featured in our June e-news. So there were 3 stories in that e-news, and all of those stories focused on gene therapy. So in previous Facebook Live sessions, we've talked a lot about emerging stem cell therapies. That was the focus of the May session. We talked a lot about that with Dr. Brian Ballios. And we haven't had a chance to talk about gene therapy in depth for a while, so that's what we're going to really dive into today. So we'll start by talking about the overview story that's titled, Will Gene Therapies Win the Race to Restore Sight? And that's a great place to start. It provides a nice overview of what's happening in the field. Next, we'll talk about the story that's titled, I'm giving you the full title so you can go to our website and read along or read up after the event. That title is Experimental Gene Therapy Completes Critical Regulatory Step. So we'll talk about that regulatory story and why it's meaningful. And then finally, we will finish up by focusing in on the story that talks about 2 ongoing clinical trials for retinal eye diseases. And we're hoping that we might get some involvement from members at AGTC, and that's the company that is involved with running these trials. So we're excited to get to talk about all of these stories today. That's the order we're going to do it in. We had tons of questions, and we're going to do our best to answer everybody's questions today, and we're going to save some time for fresh questions that come in as we go. So let's jump into it. What do you think, Chad?
I think that's a great plan.
Okay, so will gene therapies win the race to restore sight? Will they?
That's one of the main questions that we're considering here, absolutely.
I mean, this is something that we've been talking about. We've been talking about it all year at the Foundation Fighting Blindness. Who, what, who's going to win the race to restore sight? Where's it going to be won? Who's going to make it across the finish line first? And gene therapies are in the running because people have been working on gene therapies for a long time. Do you remember reading a little bit, hearing about gene therapy as almost like a science fiction idea?
Yeah. I think that's actually an interesting way of framing it, and that's something that we're going to communicate over the course of the session, I think, is that gene therapy is really moving out of the realm of fantasy or science fiction, where it just remained this kind of vague possibility. And that's what we're kind of seeing today, is that it's becoming much more tangible, especially in the world of clinical trials.
So for those of you, just to bring everybody up to speed, let's start with a really basic kind of what is gene therapy. So at the most basic level, gene therapy uses some kind of genetic intervention, like introducing a gene as a form of medicine, like genes as medicine. And there are lots of different ways that we can use genes to try and treat inherited diseases. And I'm going to let, I think that in the story, Ruan, who was involved with helping us write the story, Ruan lives with RP and also does research on RP and put together just a beautiful talk about, gene therapies in general. So I encourage all of you to go and check out the full story if you don't have a chance. But, Chad, how do you think we can use metaphors to understand gene therapy a little bit better?
Yeah, well, that's something that we got from Ruan's talk in Vancouver, actually. She's a really wonderful science communicator. She's been doing this for a while. She's thoroughly embedded in the field, so she's thinking about these issues on a daily basis in the lab and elsewhere. And I think she did a wonderful job communicating the basics, the essentials of gene therapy. And metaphors are one way that we can definitely do that. So when it comes to sort of thinking through gene therapy, what does it do? How does that actually work? One thing that Ruan suggested, and you can read this in the story actually, is that we can think about the human genome as a kind of instruction manual. So we come across instruction manuals all the time to help us do any number of things, like build furniture in our homes. And Ruan actually suggested that is one helpful way of thinking about how gene therapy actually works. So the human genome is, according to this metaphor, a kind of instruction manual. And what we know in genetic eye diseases is that certain genes are either faulty or missing. So the instruction manual is inadequate or not accurate in some way. And one thing that gene therapy does, at least in a kind of ideal scenario, is it corrects the instruction manual so that the body is able to function appropriately and so that the eye is able to do things like have those essential cells that are in the retina produce the necessary proteins so that vision is actually possible or is optimal. So I think that's a really helpful metaphor, the idea that the human genome is a kind of instruction manual that tells the body how to act. And what we see in genetic eye diseases is that the part of the manual that tells the eye what to do is sort of incorrectly expressed. And that's what genetic therapists are actually doing, is correcting the instruction manual. All of that should be framed with a certain kind of disclaimer, which is to say that it's just a metaphor, right? So the metaphor helps us kind of think through what's happening in the field in a very kind of basic way, but it shouldn't be taken as literal, because we know, for example, over decades of work in the field, that the human genome is much more complex than an IKEA manual that helps you assemble your chair or your drawer or whatever. Did you want to talk a bit about that, actually?
I mean, I have trouble with IKEA manuals, I must admit.
Yeah. See, I can only imagine the trouble that scientists are having with the human genome.
The challenge is, it's a beautiful concept to think about. When we first started to learn about the human genome, and there was this amazing human genome project, we were going to sequence the whole human genome, and we've done that. And the thing about science, which is why science is amazing, why I love science, but it can make it frustrating at the same time, because it's almost like for every answer that you get in science, for every step that you move forward, there are 10 more questions that you couldn't even formulate the questions before you knew the answer. And so it's like, as we move forward, the more that we learn, the more we realize that we don't know. And that's the nature of knowledge, right? And it's so exciting, and we are, on one hand, we're further than we've ever been before, but part of being that far is knowing, whoa, there's so much that we don't know about it. And scientists have been making incredible discoveries just about how the human genome works. And back in the day, this instruction manual, or often it's like your genes are your blueprint. And there's lots of reasons why it's a lot more complicated than that. And if it was just like a simple instruction manual, we would have cured all kinds of diseases by now. But it turns out, the way that genes get expressed to make the things they need to make, it's it's not just a one-to-one. It's not like one gene to one protein. It's like you got one gene, and depending on where you start to translate it into you can make 5 different proteins. So I won't get into the complexities of the science, but it's just to know that, we move farther along, and there's no doubt we're farther along, but there are still many questions that are actively being investigated. So that's why we have people working in the laboratory, figuring out new ways to deliver genes, new ways to make them express the amount of protein we want to express, new ways to edit genes. We haven't talked about CRISPR. We'll probably save CRISPR for a whole other talk. We'll sort of keep focused today on traditional gene therapy, which is taking a gene and delivering a new copy of this gene to the eye. Because if we got talking about CRISPR, that's a whole other.
That deserves its own Facebook Live session, I think.
I think it does. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it next week. Sure, why not? No, we're not going to do it next week. But, Ruan actually touches on that to some degree as well. Is absolutely the field is expanding in such a way that, as you said, new questions are coming to the surface, right? So we know that this instruction manual metaphor, although helpful for kind of working our way into how genetics actually functions, how the eye actually functions, is inadequate in several ways. There are new and really essential issues that have to be addressed when it comes to the complexity of the human genome. But the nice thing, and you kind of touched on this to some degree already as well, is that there are new tools and new methods that are available to researchers in genetics now today. So CRISPR, absolutely, let's talk about that later. But I'll just say very quickly is that Ruan sort of provides another very helpful metaphor, specifically in relationship to CRISPR, suggesting that we can think about CRISPR the same way that we think about a word processor. So before the introduction of word processors, we used to rely on pen and paper to actually think through language. And what word processors have done is given us a new level of precision and the ability to edit in a way that is very specific. So let's talk about CRISPR more later, but just as a kind of starting point, that's one thing that this new technology is providing scientists with, is the ability to very precisely edit genes to do exactly what they want. So I'm really excited about new advancements that are taking place in that area, and we'll have lots of opportunities to talk about those in the future.
We're excited every day about research. Come on.
We are. It's hard not to be. It's hard not to be.
And I think the big take-home message and why we get particularly excited about gene therapy is because it shows that what we're trying to do here at the Foundation Fighting Blindness, it's possible, right? We can do it. And that's the beauty of the gene therapy story. It started with an idea, and then we learn more about the disease. We learn, hey, this disease is caused by a mutation in this gene. Can we fix it in the laboratory? Can we fix it in an animal model? Hey, can we take it into a clinical trial? Let's test it out. And now we're at a stage where they've got one of these clinical trials is working so well, we're ready to make it a treatment. And so it's a huge motivation for all of us who are trying to make new treatments a reality. And so let's jump into talking about clinical trials, because we know that that's what so many of you are here to learn more about. Now, I have a question coming in here, and I'm also learning that we have lots of new viewers online, which is great. And so I will reintroduce myself. I'm Dr. Mary Sunderland, and I'm so happy that there's more people online. And I'm joined by
Dr. Chad Andrews.
And Chad works here with me at the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And so I have a question coming in here that we're going to address, as we get to the question portion. But let's talk about clinical trials. So let's think clinical trials are a kind of research, the most basic level. It's research that's testing experimental therapies in people. And hopefully a good clinical trial is based on really sound scientific evidence that was generated in a laboratory setting. And, throughout the session, we'll talk more about the details of what the different phases of clinical trials are. There's 4 different phases, and, depending on what the phase is, it shows that phase 1 is just about safety. Phase 2 is like, is this doing anything? And phase 3 is, sometimes when you get to phase 3, you introduce placebos.
Right.
And, placebos, in case you don't know, it's like a sugar pill, right? It's like the human body is amazing, and you can trick yourself to think that, like, a sugar pill is really having a positive effect on you, because the mind, body, there's a lot going on. So we'll talk more about this throughout the session. But, in anticipation of being ready to talk to all of you about ocular gene therapies, clinical trials, Chad did some research to prepare. So Chad dug into the clinicaltrials.gov registry, and he's going to share some of his key findings.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is something that Mary just said actually is really essential, and something that we're going to be hitting on again and again. It'll be a kind of theme that recurs as we move forward here, and that's that clinical trials had to be considered part of the research journey, right? So this isn't something separate. It's not like the research is ended and then we're going to clinical trials that involve, actually successful treatments in order to get a therapeutic intervention to the point that it can actually be considered as an actually validated treatment. Clinical trials are absolutely essential. So it's still exploratory research, right? We're still trying to figure out whether these approaches are safe and whether they're viable, whether they're effective. So I think it's a really helpful frame. So for those of you who are familiar with clinical trials already, you probably know that one of the primary tools that are available to you, is this website, clinicaltrials.gov. So you can just type that into your URL bar, clinicaltrials, one word, .gov, clinicaltrials.gov. And when you go there, you'll find that the site is essentially an enormous database that lists past, present, and upcoming clinical trials. And you interact with that database the same way that you interact with Google, for example, or any other search engine. There's a search bar right at the top, and if you want to know something about gene therapy, you can type gene therapy in there. If you want to know something about stem cells, you can type in stem cells, and you'll get a number of different results that basically list the clinical trials that are available to you right now, or are available for you to look into, to explore their details a little bit further. So the first thing that I did that makes the most sense, because we're talking about gene therapies, we're talking very specifically about ocular gene therapies, is I typed in ocular gene therapy into that search bar. And what you get is 640 listed clinical trials. Okay, so pages and pages of clinical trials. What you have to keep in mind, and I mentioned this already, is that is not necessarily current clinical trials. It lists clinical trials that have ended, clinical trials that have been canceled, clinical trials that are kind of on the horizon, but they're not yet recruiting. So the next thing that you may want to do when you're using this particular tool is go to the advanced search. And one thing you can do is flag specifically that you want to look at clinical trials that are recruiting. Mm-hmm. So that was the next thing I did. I searched for ocular gene therapy with the specific requirement that the findings be presented as clinical trials that are actually recruiting. So the search results you get from that are 179 trials. So still a lot of clinical trials. Those are actively recruiting clinical trials, not just in Canada, I think we should be clear about that, but globally, right? So it could be a clinical trial in London, it could be a clinical trial somewhere in Europe. So that's a lot of information, and it's really promising because it tells us that gene therapies are, experiencing a kind of boom period in the world of clinical trials. There are a lot of ongoing clinical trials. And I'll just kind of briefly mention this paper that Mary and I have been talking about. This is from 2016. It was published in Current Opinion in Ophthalmology. It's very short, but it gives a kind of overview of what's happening in the world of gene therapy clinical trials. So the authors of this particular paper, the paper, by the way, is called Update on Ocular Gene Therapy and Advances in Treatment on Inherited Retinal Diseases and Exudative Macular Degeneration, very long title, such is the way in the world of research. And as the authors kind of go on, they have a section on ongoing clinical trials. They reference a number of current trials. This is for 2016. So they mention trials for age-related macular degeneration. They mention trials for Leber's congenital amaurosis, LCA. They mention trials for choroideremia. They mention trials for Stargardt disease, for chromatopsia, for X-linked retinoschisis. We're going to be talking about some current trials, actually, focused on those diseases. So they, too, are kind of expressing this idea that gene therapy is now in a position where it's transitioning out of the kind of pure research stage in some cases and moving into the world of clinical trials where we can actually start to test these approaches in human beings. They end on this particular point in the conclusion, saying, with dozens of clinical trials currently underway for both inherited and proliferative diseases, the work of decades past has become a therapeutic reality. I think that that's a really helpful way to think about what's happening in the world of clinical trials in connection to gene therapy right now, is that we're seeing this really exciting moment where so much work has been done for decades now in the world of genetics, and now we're finally in a position where we can apply some of that research and push towards that day when we'll have a treatment at some point in the future.
So I should say, when you look on clinicaltrials.gov, and I've seen lots of doctors suggest and refer their patients to this website. You can find links to it on the FFP website, but we always have this disclaimer. And this disclaimer is even on the clinicaltrials.gov site. And they say, just because the trial is listed on this site, it doesn't mean that we're endorsing it in any way. And even more than that, it doesn't mean that it's met basic safety and regulatory requirements. And so we have been working and following the research that's done by some leaders here in Canada, Dr. Tanya Bubella, that has really shone a light on this. This is really a problem, because if this is the main resource that patients and their families are using to find trials, but if they're going to find kind of bogus trials on there, what's a patient supposed to do? And so we hope that that's a role that we can help you with. So just because you find a trial on there, it doesn't mean that it's met all the safety checks, and this doesn't even mean that it's grounded in sound science. So we hope that if after today, if you go and you're looking there and you find a trial, don't just sign up right away. I mean, please, reach out to Chad, reach out to me. We're happy to consult with you, and then absolutely talk about it with your doctor.
Yeah. So we're gonna be getting to that a little bit later on. The things that you want to look out for when you're searching clinicaltrials.gov. But Mary is absolutely right. That site is run by the National Institutes of Health, the kind of regulatory body in the U.S. that covers public health research. But there's a disclaimer on the site.
Yeah.
The NIH says very specifically that they do not, provide any kind of official approval when it comes to the trials that are listed on that site. So absolutely keep that in mind.
But really, it's hard to read the fine print sometimes, right?
It is.
I'm guilty as charged, right? How often do you get just a pop-up and you just click away just to make it get off your screen?
Who has the time? Who has the time to read the fine print?
Right?
Yeah. But as you said, I mean, that's one of the roles that we're hoping to fill at the FFB. There are so many trials out there. For example, when you search just AMD, you don't narrow it to just gene therapy. So we're taking into account artificial vision and stem cell approaches. But if you just search for AMD, you'll come across 1,328 clinical trials, with 190 of those actively recruiting. Just one more example, if you search for glaucoma, you'll find 1,204 clinical trials, with 122 of those recruiting. So there's no way that we at the FFB can go through each one of those trials and tell you which one is legitimate and which one isn't legitimate. What we can do is work with you to try to develop a set of protocols or a set of best practices when we're kind of navigating this landscape to help you think through, like, okay, what are the questions I should be asking myself? What are the questions I should be asking Mary and Chad when I reach out to them over email or over the phone?
And so I think now's a great time to jump into the questions that came from all of our viewers. And, I think one question that came in from Wendy, who's 59, living with RP, and she says, what do you recommend for me? What do you recommend for me? What should I do to make sure that I can be ready? And so Wendy, who's living with RP, like here in Canada, we're going to give some advice to you and everybody living in Canada, but hopefully, regardless of where you're living in the world, you can use this to make sure that you're ready. So the number one thing that you need to do if you're living, this doesn't apply to age-related macular degeneration, but it does apply to everybody who's living with an IRD. Sometimes you see IRD, that stands for inherited retinal dystrophy. Sometimes people just talk about retinal dystrophies, but these are diseases like retinitis pigmentosa, Usher syndrome, choroideremia, juvenile retinoschisis, Bardet-Biedl syndrome. I'm just sort of rattling off the top of my head. Stargardt disease. Go to our website. Any of these inherited, degenerative retinal diseases, what you need to do is get a genetic diagnosis. Get your gene testing done. And in Canada, we know that's easier said than done, right? I have spoken with patients who had an easy time. they're living in Toronto, maybe they went to Sick Kids Hospital, where we have our patient registry, where Dr. Elise Ayon, who's like a leading ophthalmologist in this area, has got everything figured out to help people not just get the testing, but also get genetic counseling, which is such an important part of the process. But we've also heard from so many of you that were turned away. Maybe your optometrist said, you know, sorry, Wendy, you're 59 and there's no treatment for you, so don't worry about it. We know that happens because we've heard from you, because you've shared those stories with us. And I'm sorry, but at this time, you need to be your own best advocate. So we're trying to arm you with tools that will allow you to go back to your optometrist. And in Canada, it can be your optometrist. Your optometrist can give you a referral to get genetic testing done. So, we'll provide some links in the comments where you can take we have a little handout, everything you need to know about genetic testing. We can give you some information about the patient registry and just say, you know what, I know you don't think I need this because there's no treatment for me right now, but I need this done because it's part of how I learn about what disease I have. This is part of how I get a diagnosis. And, if that optometrist won't do it for you, let us know. And we can help you find another optometrist. Unfortunately, we know it might not be easy, but you got to keep at it, right?
You do, and that's something that we're working on at the foundation, absolutely, is helping you be the best self-advocate possible. And it's one of the unfortunate realities in Canadian healthcare, or any healthcare system for that matter, is that there are gaps, there are certain inequities in both healthcare and vision care, and we're doing our best to kind of help you work through them. So we know for a fact that if you're in a rural part of Canada, it could be harder for you to access an ophthalmologist or to access genetic testing services. So really, we want to do our best to provide you with the tools so that you can advocate for yourself and for the absolute necessity of obtaining your genetic profile.
Now, I'm having so much fun, Chad, that we're just nattering away here a little bit. So I'm just going to make sure we get to people's questions.
Absolutely.
So the next question is about, when will these treatments be ready? And so this comes from Blossom, from Linda, who want to know, great, I need this treatment now. When's it going to be ready? This is a hard question to answer because clinical trials are a kind of research, and there's a certain amount of unpredictability in research. And, once people get to the clinical trial stage, they're able to make more specific plans and really sharp targets about when they want to be, where they want to be. I don't know if anyone online would want to contribute to this answer, thinking about how do you know how long it's going to take. It depends, but it can be anywhere from once you get to the clinical trial stage. A phase 1 trial might take a couple years, a phase 2-3 trial might take a couple years, and then hopefully we can get through those final regulatory steps without too much trouble. The next question, what genes and what diseases will gene therapy work for? So we have people, Karen and Linda, who sent in questions about the Ushers. There's an ongoing Usher clinical trial for USH2A. And Maura wanted to know about Stargardt's disease. So there's a company, Sanofi, which is helping to oversee both of these trials, the USHSAT trial and the trial involved with Stargen, I think is the Stargardt's disease trial. So right now, I know that neither of these trials, these are both actively recruiting trials. Neither of them have reported anything about efficacy, like whether this works. But so far, neither have reported adverse events. So that's terminology you hear, a negative side effect, something bad that's happened. So it's good news that everybody seems safe, and you have to keep in mind, that's the first step, is showing that it's safe. And I believe the Stargardt's trial has enrolled 24 patients. It's still recruiting. There are multiple sites, and if you have more specific questions, we'll get those to you about exactly where you can enroll. And the Ushers trial has enrolled, I think, 9 patients, and they're still actively recruiting. And then there are also questions from Mickey and Emma about X-linked retinoschisis. And so that's our final story, where we will be talking about the AGTC trial that is actively recruiting patients with X-linked retinoschisis. And then Mancy was asking about RP Grip, and we're thrilled. You know, we've met wonderful people at Odelia, which is kind of like a nonprofit that's set up to help drive this stuff into the clinic. So, I mean, RP Grip is the very top of their list. So lots going on, and we have, you know, many specific answers about, you know, exactly what's happening with different trials, and we encourage you to contact Chad.
Yeah. So basically, if you have a retinal degenerative disease, it's worth looking into genetic therapy, and you can do that through clinicaltrials.gov, or you can do that by reaching out to us.
But I should interrupt because it's what I do, Chad.
Yeah.
Probably too much.
That's okay.
No, just because you mentioned it's worth if you have a retinal degeneration disease. And that's sort of the next question is like, but will it work for somebody that's already lost their vision? This is a question from Maria Fernanda, from Chrissy, like, what if they've already lost their vision? And, you know, there are people who are working on therapies that could restore sight. So this, you know, probably, again, it doesn't hurt to get your genetic testing done. You should do that regardless. But there was a really exciting trial started by Retrosense Therapeutics last year involving optogenetics, which is basically if your photoreceptor cells have died, this gene therapy trial is introducing like a gene that can make other cells in your eye light sensitive. It's truly incredible work. And they, again, I think they've enrolled about 3 patients, and so far no adverse events, but no efficacy results presented yet either. And Peggy wants to know, where are the trials happening? So, you know, you can look on clinicaltrials.gov to see, you know, there are trials happening all around the world, and we're going to move into talking about some of the trials that AGTC are working on, and these trials are happening at multiple sites in the United States, but we're really excited about them here in Canada because patients who have X-linked retinoschisis or achromatopsia are welcome to enroll in these trials in the United States. So part of what we're trying to do here at the Foundation Fighting Blindness, of course, we want more clinical trials to happen here. That's part of what, you know, we hope that our patients living in Canada can help to show, like, we're here and we're ready to participate in trials. But we're also thrilled whenever, you know, patients living in Canada have an opportunity to go and participate in a trial south of the border.
Absolutely. So, I mean, one frustration that we know that patients experience is sometimes you get your genetic testing done, you can't access a trial. So actually, Debbie Marsh has just recently asked a question about that. She asked what happens after the genetic testing is complete. We had this test done and submitted and have not heard a thing since. That was about 2 years ago. Who do we contact now? So that's another thing that is worth flagging, right? Is that, as Mary has been discussing, clinical trials are part of the research process. And we have to take into account that there are certain variables. Clinical trials have to have parameters as well. So you may not get into certain clinical trials if you don't meet certain qualifications, and that could have to do with your disease type or your age. So unfortunately, there's no way for us to say for sure that here is your sort of access card to get into a clinical trial. We can do our best to find appropriate trials and to you know, give you access to them.
But also what I see, like what Debbie's getting at is like she had the test done and then radio silence, right? And we know that's common too.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, like we can't find the answer for you, Debbie, but I would start by go back to the doctor that made the referral and just start tracing the paper trail. Start working your way backwards, and hopefully you can help to find an answer. But again, it's where you need to be your advocate.
Right,
like, should you have gotten the results? Yes. I don't know why somebody didn't deliver them to you, but, you know, you have to sometimes do some chasing around, you know, and that's, you know, hopefully we can work to a place where that doesn't happen as much. But right now we know it happens far too often.
Yeah. One thing you can do at the same time, Debbie, as well, if you haven't already, is you can reach out to us to get on our patient registry. That's something we may talk about in a bit more detail if we have the time. But we actually don't require you to submit any genetic testing, at least at the outset, when it comes to signing up for our registry. So if you haven't already, you can go to our website and find the patient registry, or you can contact me directly, because that's something that I do, is work with our patient registry, and we can get you signed up for that.
Mm-hmm. So it took us a long time to get through all of the questions about the first story, but I think it flows very nicely into the second story, which we only will mention very briefly, and it's that a biotechnology company, Spark Therapeutics, which helped to run a whole set of clinical trials, phase 1, 2, phase 3, seeing positive results all along the way for a blinding eye disease that's sort of a rare form of retinitis pigmentosa called Leber's congenital amaurosis. You may know it as LCA. And they're at a point where they've sort of made a filing to the Food and Drug Administration, that's the FDA, to show, like, you know, we have got all the data we need to show that this is, you know, we had it as an experimental treatment, but now it looks like it could be an actual treatment, you know, moving out of the realm of experimental and into the realm of reality. And their lead drug candidate, Veretagene Neparvavac, is, you know, hopefully soon going to be reviewed by the FDA. So, you know, we still need patients to step up and talk about, you know, how a gene therapy might impact their lives, because as these drugs are being reviewed and we pioneer a new path forward to think about how could we make gene therapy a reality here in Canada and around the world, what can patients do to help accelerate this reality, you know, into today? Mm-hmm. And that's, you know, really what you need to know about sort of this second story. It's just that after all of the research happens, all the clinical research, all the basic research, there's a whole, it's almost like public policy research. It's like research in this new space of how do we make these innovative therapies work in the health systems that we have around the world.
Yeah, it's a really exciting submission. This is the first time that a gene therapy has made it this far, right? It's made it to the point that it can actually submit its results to a regulatory body, which is bringing us, once again, one step closer to a potential treatment. In fact, the submission included data from the phase 3 trial. So phase 3 is one below the highest phase, and phase 3 trials often involve data from specific patient populations. So it's really getting very specific and you know, pushing to the point that we can actually sort of get the treatment into the form that is most important for you.
I see another question has come in from our live viewers, and we always like to answer the questions from our live viewers. And so Allison is asking, is there a minimum age requirement to participate in a clinical trial? So the answer is, it depends. And it depends on the specific trial. So the general answer is, you know, not really. And lots of people who are quite old have participated in trials. We like to talk about the first stem cell trial in Japan that involved, you know, a woman who's 78. And then there are also trials that involve children. So there's a whole range. And how you discover about your specific age and your specific treatment, and if there's a trial that seems to be a good fit for you, you need to look at what's called the eligibility criteria. So we're not going to get into the details about eligibility criteria, but that's something you'd really need to sit down with your doctor and think about other people who are involved with the trial to really understand, am I someone who would be eligible to be in this trial? And so usually age is often, you know, they'll indicate the specifics about what ages are eligible. And so maybe we can then shift into our final story that's looking at these two ongoing clinical trials, actually 3 trials, that are being run by AGTC. So this is, you know, we're really thrilled to be talking about these trials because in 2012, here at the Foundation Fighting Blindness in Canada, we were funding work by Dr. Bob Molday, who is just, you know, kind of like the grandfather in the field in Canada of ocular genetics. He's fantastic. I've toured around his lab. It's amazing, the work that he's done. So in 2012, we were funding him thanks to Foundation Fighting Blindness donors. He published a great paper about X-linked retinoschisis. And today, if you go to the AGTC site, you'll see that his paper has really laid the groundwork for this trial that they're actively recruiting. That means they are welcoming patients to come and see if they are eligible to participate. So you can go to the AGTC website. We'll make sure there's a link in the comments. And from there, you can also go to the clinicaltrials.gov page about the specific X-linked retinoschisis trial. And on that page, there'll be a section, Eligibility Criteria, and it'll list all of the things that you need to have an RS1 mutation. This is the mutation that affects pretty much everybody with X-linked retinoschisis. I say pretty much everybody because there's a few people that might seem to have X-linked retinoschisis but don't have this gene mutation. Another reason why you need to get your genetic testing done, right? And so this is the kind of trial where there's a lot of bogus stuff happening on the clinicaltrials.gov website, but you can go and you can look at this page and understand this is kind of a legitimate setup where it's rooted in the science and it's designed in such a way to get meaningful results, right? You have to remember, a clinical trial is an experiment. So these trials are designed very carefully because they are incredibly expensive. They cost a ton of money. And so people want to make sure they can get data, get results that mean something, right? Because if you design an experiment poorly, your results are meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. And so this is the kind of trial that's designed very carefully to get results that will answer the question, is this gene therapy safe? Is it safe? And it's a phase 1-2 trial, so that the phase 1 part answers, is it safe? If I inject it into somebody's eye, is it going to hurt them in some way, right? And the second part is, it's that little bit of efficacy. It's do we see that this is having any kind of impact on the disease progression? So we will be watching really carefully. And if you can, I was really surprised when I learned this. So would you believe that so many clinical trials for retinal diseases actually have trouble recruiting enough patients? This surprised me when I heard this, right? Because the people that we know are the people who are with us online, the people that we talk to on the phone every day, people who are really eager and wanting to participate in trials. So it always, it really shocked me when I heard that many trials have a hard go at it because they can't find the patients.
Sure, yeah,
Right?
It's shocking. I mean, we know that there's an enormous need out there, and we know that there seem to be enough trials to at least meet some of that need. But what we also know is that there's a kind of communications gap, right? It's difficult for researchers to get information involving the trials into the hands of patients, and it's difficult for patients to access that information in the first place. And I think that clinicaltrials.gov, it's a wonderful tool, but it also sort of illustrates that gap to some degree as well, because it's like I said, a wall of information. You're bombarded with trials. It's often in a kind of science jargon-heavy language, which can be very difficult to parse. So yes, we're seeing an explosion of trials in the world of gene therapy, but we're also seeing this strange kind of discrepancy, as you've been talking about, between the number of trials and the number of patients, but the fact that trials are also struggling to get the patients recruited that they actually need. So that's an issue that we're trying to work through.
And so I should mention that the other trial that AGTC is actively recruiting for is another trial we're really excited about because it involves achromatopsia. Now, we are currently funding, the Foundation Fighting Blindness Canada donors are funding achromatopsia research by Dr. Valerie Wallace to learn more about this disease. But at the same time, AGTC is funding a trial, sort of two different kinds of trials that look at the main genetic causes of achromatopsia, which is another one of these inherited conditions that leads to loss of visual acuity, extreme light sensitivity, that leads to a daytime blindness. So it's almost like the opposite of RP, retinitis pigmentosa, where you have the night blindness. Achromatopsia is like a daytime blindness because it involves the cone photoreceptor cells first and foremost. In contrast, retinitis pigmentosa involves the rod photoreceptors. And so I'm thrilled. I'm just seeing here that there are members from AGTC who are online right now. And I know we have one question that we really are hoping that they can help us answer, because overwhelmingly, people in our community want to know, like, how does a biotechnology company like AGTC, like, how do you decide the next disease you're going to be working on? Like, how is your pipeline, the things that you're working on and researching, how can you decide which is the next disease, which is the next gene? And I think part of the answer is if a biotechnology company is going to invest significant resources, millions and millions and millions of dollars, to do this clinical research, they need to know that what they're going to get in the end, that treatment in the end, that there are patients who are ready to have that treatment. So again, that's part of why you need to show, put your hand up if you have X-linked retinoschisis, if you have chromatopsia, find a way to connect and say, like, I'm here and I'll be lining up to participate, to help in the trial, to be a recipient of the treatment if it makes it that far.
So patient need is part of that equation for why certain forms of research are pursued. So we know that we have some representatives from AGTC online right now. So by all means, feel free to provide some insight into that process if you're able.
Because that's a question that we're always grappling with here at the foundation, and trying to understand and figure out how we can really accelerate everything together. And what are, as a patient organization, at the foundation fighting blindness, what can we do to help accelerate the progress? What can we do to change the process to make it work better? What can we do to make connections between interested patients and trials that might be, that might be a good fit for them? So that's something we're always working on. And I know that, the other big question that we mentioned earlier, it's timelines. Like, when is this going to be ready? When can I get it off the shelf? And, we can't give you a specific answer. I asked everybody this question. And because this question is meaningful to me, I'm keeping tabs and trying to figure out, like, how can you get an answer that is not a guess, right? How do you get an answer that's rooted in evidence and it's a sound prediction based on, if everything works out the way you think it's going to work, how is this going to progress along? And I challenge everybody that we're involved with to provide me with their very best answer to that question, because as at the patient organization, like, that answer means everything to us. It keeps us going. It fuels us forward. And even when there's diversity in the answers, that's okay, as long as it's rooted in that sound explanation. And I also say, like, thank goodness we're at a time when we're at this stage, right? Like, we're in the clinic. Like, we were never here before. So it's great. But we still need to find ways to make things go faster. We still need to find ways to get satisfying answers for everybody. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's a question that I get on the phone a lot, the when question. We know that it's absolutely essential. We want to know when we're going to see that particular translation take place from research to clinical trials into actual treatments. And I think we keep on hitting on this point about clinical trials being part of the research process, clinical trials being an extension of that, exploratory research, because there is a lack of predictability there. It's difficult to answer that question. We want to sort of hone in on it as much as we can, get a sense of when we're going to see the work move forward, but it's difficult and in many cases impossible to answer that without giving false hope.
But there are a few things we know for sure, right? One thing we know for sure, the more people that get their genetic testing, the more people that come and sign up in our patient registry, that stand up and say, hey, I'm ready, and I want to be ready. Or even say, hey, I'm not ready yet, but I want to be ready. I want to make Canada ready. I want to make sure we're ready for this. That makes a difference. Yeah. The other thing we know that makes a difference is, like, jeepers, this stuff costs so much money. So we are so thankful to all of the Foundation Fighting Blindness donors who have got us to this place. Like, if you don't fund it, nobody's going to do it.
Yeah.
That's just the reality. So, thank you to everybody who's helped to bring us to where we are today.
Yeah, just because there's uncertainty in the research doesn't mean that we can be apathetic. That's one thing that's astounded me since I started working for the foundation, is just how apt that name is, the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And Mary's already expressed this, but that's what we need to do. We need to fight to push the research forward, fight to get as many clinical trials in Canada as possible so that we can produce a cure as quickly as possible, so that it affects as many as possible, so that it improves the lives of as many as possible. That's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. So we should get back to that soon, because
we should get back to that.
Yes. We should get back to fighting blindness. But we've had so much fun talking with all of you today, and it's great to have Chad here and to have all of you online, and thank you for sending your questions in. There are sort of 5 tips that we want to leave you with about how to actually, we're writing up our 5 tips. We're going to polish them. We'll get them online.
Sure.
The one tip we want you to look out for to make sure that you don't get involved with kind of a bogus clinical trial, it's a big red flag. If you have to pay a lot of money to get involved with that trial, beware, right? Beware. Because if a trial is really promising, designed well, it's got good financial backing, like, for example, like the AGTC trial or SPARK trial, or, the choroideremia trial that we're funding here in Alberta, that's a sign. It's legitimate. So, that's something you can just beware.
Yeah,
right?
that's a helpful kind of red flag to help guide you through this kind of complicated landscape. And if it looks legitimate, but they're also asking to pay, you're uncertain, then by all means you can reach out to us as well. We can figure this out together.
Absolutely. And we'll be following up with a story about sort of really more specific suggestions about how you can make your way through this just growing massive information
Absolutely.
On the internet.
Yeah.
There's more stuff on that internet every day.
There's a lot of stuff on the internet. It's bizarre, isn't it?
So, Bo, I love answering your questions. It's great getting to know you. I hope you've got a chance to get to know Dr. Chad Andrews a little bit today as well.
Yeah, it's been great. I hope that I have the opportunity to talk to more of you over the phone, over email, and elsewhere. It's been really great being part of this session.
Yeah, and so thank you to everybody who participated. We do this for everybody who tunes in and for everybody who couldn't join us live. We hope that if you thought of a question while you were listening to this, please send it in, because we're here to help you find answers to your questions. If we don't have them here, we're so happy to have partners, in the pharmaceutical world, in the biotech world, in the research world, in the clinical world. I'm off to an ophthalmology conference next weekend. We're trying to connect with everybody that can get those answers and find a way forward together.
Yeah, and when it comes to this video, thanks for tuning in. If you liked it, please share it with your friends and actually like the video on Facebook. That would be really helpful.
And don't forget that this video, we do this monthly, and it's based on our monthly e-news, which is just a riveting read every month. So if you haven't signed
We're
up,
not biased at all.
So if you haven't signed up for our e-news, there's a link I think in the description, and you can get yourself signed up. And then if you sign up for the e-news, you will also be able to hear the latest and greatest whenever there's a research breakthrough. We always share it with our community. You'll be the first to know, and sometimes because we have these great relationships with people, we get to be the first to know too. So we love to share those exciting moments. Sign up for our e-news. I hope that you'll participate in our next Facebook Live session. It's something that we certainly look forward to every month.
Absolutely.
And now I guess we've got to go back to fighting blindness together.
Well, let's go fight some blindness.
Okay.
Got to do something on a Friday afternoon.
Bye, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.